A conviction doesn't always mean justice has been served. Today, we're going over 10 cases where the justice system failed, and as a result, people were imprisoned for years or even died for crimes they never committed. And we're starting off with Anthony Porter. So in 1983, Anthony Porter was sent to prison for having taken the life of Marilyn Green and her fiance Jerry Hillard in 1982. They'd been shot while at a swimming pool. A handful of witnesses claimed to have seen Porter around the scene of the crime, and because he was also a gang member, he became the only man authorities were going after, even though witnesses had pointed to other suspects. Porter was convicted and sentenced to death for the crime, and he became this close to his sentence actually being carried out. But in late 1998, just 2 days before Porter was going to actually head to his death, it was halted. Journalism students and their professor at Northwestern University found new evidence. They discovered that a key witness who testified against Porter had changed their story, saying they were pressured by the police to testify against him. And another man named Alstory Simon confessed to committing the crime for which Porter was being convicted for. Anthony Porter was finally released from death row after spending 17 years in prison for a crime he never committed. Unfortunately, Mahmood Hussein Mattan wasn't as lucky as Anthony Porter. He was convicted for a crime he didn't commit and was hanged. On March 6th of 1952, a Cardiff shopkeeper named Lily Valport was brutally attacked. Mattan, who lived nearby, became the prime suspect. One witness said they'd seen a man matching Mattan's description leaving the shop that night. Mattan was arrested on March 28th of 1952. Now, there was barely any evidence tying this man to the crime. He was convicted mostly based on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Really, all they had was the one witness who claimed to have seen him near the crime scene, and someone else said they saw him with a wad of banknotes soon after the incident. He was sentenced to death and hanged on September 3rd of 1952, just 6 months after Volport's death. He was the last prisoner to be hanged in Cardiff prison. And then decades later, in 1998, the case was reopened by the Cardiff-based Miscarriages of Justice organization. It was found that there had been evidence withheld in court that would have helped prove Mattan's innocence, and Lord Justice Rose referred to the case as, quote, demonstrably flawed. The family was compensated with 725,000 quid and Mattan's name was cleared. Next, we have three brothers who were framed for one of the worst robberies in Australian history. And who were they framed by? The cops. At least that's what the Mickelberg Brothers think. The case has never really officially been solved as to who actually robbed all the gold anyway. Point is, these three didn't do it, and the trial was not fair. The case is known as the Perth Mint swindle. So all this mess happened in Australia in 1982. The mastermind behind this elaborate scheme is thought to be an English businessman with a history of fraudulent activity, but that's still not 100% proven. Basically, a whole whackload of gold bars were stolen, and brothers Ray, Peter, and Brian Mickelberg were wrongfully implicated. They were accused of being part of the conspiracy to replace gold bars with replicas at the Perth Mint. The police mostly based their case on a controversial confession obtained from Ray, which he'd been pressured to make. The trial in 1982 resulted in the brothers being convicted. One of them only spent 9 months in prison, but died in an accident soon after being released. Peter spent 8 years in prison, Ray spent 6. But then 20 years later, Tony Lewandowski, one of the arresting officers, admitted to having framed the trio along with the help of another officer. He also said that Brian Mickelberg had been beaten while in custody. So in 2004, the brothers had their names cleared and were each compensated with $500,000. Next up, we have the case that was responsible for the movie The Fugitive starring Harrison Ford. Good movie. The Sam Sheppard case. So on the morning of July 4th, 1954, Sam's wife, Marilyn, was found dead in their home in Bay Village, Ohio. They'd had some friends over the night before. Dr. Sheppard, an osteopathic physician, claimed that a bushy-haired intruder had broken into their home and knocked him unconscious before attacking his wife. Police didn't see any signs signs of a break-in though, and Sam Sheppard became the #1 suspect. On July 30th of 1954, Dr. Sheppard was arrested and charged with the crime. This case is just an absolute nightmare. Not only do you have to suffer the loss of your spouse at the hands of some home invader, but then you're being blamed for it. I just can't imagine how maddening this mix of emotions must have been. Anger, sadness, confusion, desperation. Now, Dr. Sheppard's defense argued that the investigation was flawed, that there was a lack of physical evidence tying him to the crime. But the jury found Dr. Sheppard guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But in 1964, Dr. Sheppard's case reached the US Supreme Court, and it was ruled that Sheppard had been denied a fair trial. His conviction was overturned, and a new trial was ordered. This second trial painted a very different picture, and it was clear that Sheppard had been innocent. On November 16th of 1966, Dr. Sheppard was finally acquitted, and finally the end to an over 10-year-long legal nightmare. Next up, we have the Central Park jogger case. Here, 5 young men were convicted of a horrendous crime, which they never committed. On the evening of April 19th, a 28-year-old woman named Tricia Maley was violently attacked while jogging in the park. She was found in a ravine, beaten beyond recognition, and was in a coma for 12 days. The investigation led to the wrongful conviction of 5 young men: Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McRae, Yusuf Salem, and Corey Wise. None of their DNA matched what was found at the crime scene, but they'd been identified by witnesses as having been involved or at the scene of other crimes taking place at the park around the time. The police apprehended the 5 boys, who were interrogated without legal counsel, and they ended up being coerced into actually pleading guilty. This was a big case at the time, so it was all over the news and the papers, and there was a lot of pressure to find the person or persons responsible. Unfortunately, these 5 became the scapegoats. They were found guilty and sent to prison, but years later in 2002, a man named Matthias Reyes confessed to the crime, saying he'd acted alone and provided DNA evidence linking him to the scene. The convictions of the Central Park 5 were vacated in December of 2002. Next on the list, we have the Birmingham Six. In 1974, on November 21st, 2 pubs in Birmingham were destroyed with explosive devices. 21 people died, and over 180 others were injured. The explosives were part of a series of IRA attacks during the Troubles, which was a period of conflict in Northern Ireland. The Birmingham Six, consisting of Hugh Callahan, Patrick Joseph Hill, Gerard Hunter, Richard McClenny, William Power, and John Walker, were wrongfully convicted in August of 1975 for their alleged involvement in the attacks. The trial took place at Lancaster Crown Court, and the prosecution's case relied heavily on confessions obtained from the defendants, which they later claimed were coerced through physical and psychological torment. It wasn't until 1991, after nearly 17 years of incarceration, that the Birmingham Six were finally released. There was new evidence pointing to the fact that police had suppressed vital information and that the confessions had been coerced. Rubin Hurricane Carter was a professional boxer who in 1966, along with John Artis, was accused of involvement in a crime. They were accused of being involved in a triple homicide at a bar in Paterson, New Jersey. 3 people had died during a robbery. Prosecution's case primarily relied on eyewitness testimonies, but over time became pretty apparent that these accounts were inconsistent and unreliable. Both he and Artis were sentenced to life in prison in the initial 1967 trial, but Carter's legal team didn't give up and persisted in challenging the convictions through appeals. They were tried and convicted twice. Finally, in 1985, Carter's convictions were overturned and he was released from prison after nearly 2 decades of wrongful incarceration. He later moved to Toronto, where he worked as the executive director of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted from 1993 to 2005. Next on the list are the Norfolk Four. In Norfolk, Virginia, 4 sailors, Derek Tice, Eric Wilson, Daniel Williams and Joseph Dick found themselves accused of a crime they didn't commit in 1997. A woman named Michelle Moore Bosco had been violently attacked and died while these men had been stationed at the Naval Station Norfolk. At first, the men were adamant that they were innocent, but were coerced once again into making false confessions. It's always hard to believe that someone would confess to doing something they know they didn't do, but when you're told not cooperating can land you in prison for longer, and that you might get a deal if you confess and own up, some people, they just feel completely helpless, and more often than you'd want to believe, this is the result. So these false confessions were used to convict the men, even though there was a lack of physical evidence. DNA evidence not only failed to match any of the Norfolk Four to the crime, but another man, Omar Ballard, admitted to authorities that he'd been responsible for the crime. He'd already been in prison for 2 separate attacks on other women in 1997, so the case was re-examined, and in 2009, after years of legal challenges, the Norfolk Four finally received conditional pardons from the governor of Virginia. It wasn't until 2017, though, that they received absolute pardons. Darryl Hunt. So in 1984, Deborah Sykes, a newspaper copy editor, was brutally attacked and died at the hands of an unknown assailant. But Darryl Hunt was arrested for the crime. He maintained his innocence throughout the entire trial, and during the trial, a witness testified that they apparently saw Hunt near the crime scene, and the prosecution really emphasized his criminal record, even though it was completely unrelated to the case at hand. In 1984, Darryl Hunt was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He spent nearly 19 years behind bars. And he only got out because in 2003, advancements in DNA technology came about, and it was discovered that the DNA evidence collected from the crime scene didn't match Hunt's. It actually belonged to a man named Willard Brown. In 2004, after spending almost 2 decades in prison, Darryl Hunt was exonerated and released. But the damage had already been done. Like, Hunt would never be the same. He did become an advocate for criminal justice reform, but ended up taking his own life in 2016. Finally, we had to talk about the Salem witch trials. There are a lot of dark things from history that we can learn from, but the Salem witch trials, they're no exception. A perfect example of how quickly blind accusations and fear can lead to complete mass hysteria. The Salem witch trials occurred in colonial Massachusetts. I never know how to say Massachusetts. Massachusetts. There we go. It occurred in Massachusetts in 1692. People began getting accused of witchcraft in the Salem village community, most of them women. It all started when a group of young girls claimed to be possessed by witches, accusing several residents of practicing witchcraft. These accusations quickly snowballed, leading to this wave of arrests and trials, unfair trials, mind you. There was a lack of any due process. There was a reliance on eyewitness testimony over any physical evidence. Dreams and visions were even used as evidence, which is about as bottom of the barrel as you can get. Hundreds of people were accused, and a number of people were hanged, including 14 women and 5 men. With all that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.